I'd say we continue directly with Samu, Szemerey, I hope I got it right. Yeah, almost. From Hungary, and sort of jump a couple of 100 kilometers to the north. And Samu is an urbanist, and we met him on our field office project where we went to Budapest and Prague. And Samu sort of came along and asked us a lot of very interesting questions and helped us kind of reflect on what we were doing, sitting there making games. And I'm really looking forward to your talk, which is going to be about being playful in a post-socialist context. And I'm glad you're here. Welcome to the Playpublik. And here's your microphone.
Thank you. So welcome everyone, and also very glad to be here. I think it's been an extremely exciting conference, at least for me who is an outsider. So I look at urban games as an architect, an urbanist, as a designer, which is, I think, partly the perspective of someone who is actually interested in gaming, but also the perspective of someone who is interested in games as a methodology and a sort of platform for exchanging knowledge and thinking about, well, in my case, the city and our environment. This is what I'm going to talk about. What we think of games in post-socialist cities, which will need a sort of some definitions, but basically what I'm interested in is what are the sort of constituencies that help construct these situations, and what are the sort of underlying systems that games tap into when they happen in such cities. So to start with, here's an urban game for a socialist city, that is. I don't know, those of you who know the photograph, don't give spoilers. For those of you who don't know, this is a game which includes about 8 to 10 persons. It's pretty fast-paced, and I'll leave you with that for now, and we'll get back to it. Just remember the photograph and try to find out or think about it, what it might entail. So. But then let's see what I mean by games for the sake of this talk. So first of all, I think the urban games are the ones that are embedded in their immediate context through narrative and perspective tools. So on one hand, the stories they tell are directly linked to the cities which they're situated in. On the other hand, they also use the sites, so the environment as a visual ground, as a setting. On the other hand, this also means that from parallel worlds, so sort of fictional narratives, we're moving to the actual constituencies of the players. So it's not really about, or at least the games that I'm interested in, or I'm going to talk about, attempt to look at the actual everyday realities instead of constructing fictions that are removed and only use their background as a setting. And thirdly, they create shared experiences for the participants, and we'll see why this is important. So when we link that up with post-socialist cities, we can say that sort of this embeddedness is a tool to reveal the everyday urban context, and we'll try to find out why this might be important. So stuff that might be invisible becomes visible through the run of the games. The sort of realistic aspect, the sort of speculative realism aspect of the games is something which might reconnect space with its production. So if you look at this term of Lefebvre of the production of social space, I'll try to describe why I think that in post-socialist cities and in socialist cities also, the production of space, the sort of power systems that control space are removed from the environment, and games can provide a platform to actually reverse that situation and sort of put the production of space back into space itself. And thirdly, shared experiences question the individualism that is still prevalent in many of these cultures, where individual survival, or today you could say individual success, is really rated high above common social code and social good and the city as a sort of shared project. But we need, in order to sort of understand back, we need to go back a bit from post-socialist cities to socialist cities, and I'll talk largely about Budapest and the Hungarian context, and so this means a sort of degree of generalization, but I think that's sort of acceptable for the sake of this talk. Of course, there are sort of changes in each culture, but I think that some of the big trends can be looked at in general. So, what happens in socialist cities? in the case of Budapest, there was a sort of very distinct consolidation period after the 1956 revolution, which is largely a sort of unspoken social contract that had its key thesis in separating private and public freedom in general. So this means that if you sort of signed this social contract for which you didn't really have any options, and you kind of removed yourself from the public sphere, you had a relative degree of freedom in your private sphere for exchange. So that meant that in terms of public spaces of the city, there were no upsetting changes from the side of the state. So the state removed itself from public spaces largely. There were hardly any new public spaces built between 56 and 1919 in Budapest. As any sort of intervention that would be really upsetting in an urban space would have referred to all the issues that were sort of tucked behind the sort of untouched public spaces, so would have referred to the revolution, which was the sort of #1 taboo to talk about. In exchange, by users, so by the inhabitants of the city, there were no uncontrolled uses, so neither of these would lead to any sort of unexpected consequences of having to talk about public space as a social experience, as a social platform, as a sort of container of memories and knowledge. This, of course, inevitably led to a fragmentation of the perception of this space, of the perception of the city. So you would have a lot of individual cities, a lot of individual routes in Budapest of personal tracks of your own individual life, which didn't add up to a social experience. So, because adding up to a sort of community experience would have created a risk to get into this sort of uncanny field about what our life is as a fiction. And that also led to the emergence of a so-called second public sphere, which in itself was a very interesting phenomenon. It was a public sphere that was not entirely illegal. It was not legal either. It was existing besides the sort of mainstream first media landscape. That also included samizdat, the sort of illegal publications on the one hand, but also included magazines that were not explicitly funded by the state, so it was a sort of negotiated space. And I think this sort of negotiation is one of the key points of what the socialist public sphere was about. So the separation of these public and private freedoms also meant a sort of continuous negotiation of the borderlines. So it was always sort of, nothing was clear enough. So each of your decision would have to be negotiated of where you would be making a compromise with the state. So there's, you know, if you think of this as a game, you would always come up with a sort of double reality situation where you would be, your goal is to evade the state. So that is surveillance. On the one hand, on the other hand, to evade the planned economy by sort of turning it to your own individual profit. On that sort of, you can see this in the allotment gardens where the personal cottages were built from any material that you could steal from the factory that you were working on, and so on. So there's several ways to look at that. But each side, so both the state and the inhabitants, were really invested in maintaining this sort of shared fiction of the reality of socialism that they were living in, through this negotiation and through sort of keeping up this kind of illusion of a public sphere, illusion of a city that we share. So one of the key or sort of easiest ways to look at the sort of how social space was fragmented is the naming of the spaces, the naming of the city. Although there were official names for streets and squares, which of course changed during socialism, everybody could sort of pick their own names from the periods of the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and depending on what you named a certain square, you could sort of build up your own identity. Or if you were telling me we should meet on a certain square, and you were giving me a certain name, I would sort of know where you are. But it would be a sort of individual construction of what the city is and what the space is. So you'd have this sort of imagined life versus a lived life, and these things were living embedded into each other. Quite like, I don't know if any of you've read the novel The City and the City by China Miéville, which is also sort of based on a post-socialist fictional scenario, but very much like that. There would be a sort of invisible city which you would still perceive there. So one of the key documents of this is a film called Little Valentino from 1981, which is about a young person working in a factory who one day basically breaks off with the salaries of his colleagues, and he's an accountant, so he just takes the money and leaves, and he starts a tour in the city, which is really a kind of a derive. He sits in a car and he just or in a taxi, and then he just wanders around the city, and what he does is really breaking this contract of maintaining this fiction, and he starts playing out a fiction for his own. So he sort of starts to play roles in the city. He starts spending like crazy in restaurants where he is going by a cab. Afterwards, he has to flee from the waiters who are chasing him. He's visiting private apartments, which is a kind of peep into this private sphere of freedom and a sort of alternative reality, as opposed to the public spaces of the city. And he's also playing as if he was a foreign visitor. So he buys foreign language newspapers, and he sits in a cafe, and he sort of acts as if there was a possibility for an authentic, independent existence within urban space, which of course inevitably leads him to disaster. So he sort of walks in the police station by himself at night, so at the end of the day. But he has this one day of imagined freedom, of playing the city as an independent space. And there we are back at the game. So this game involves an oppositional figure, this guy, who is fleeing from his personal shadows, the secret police, who involves about 8 to 10 persons following him closely. And this situation is a very famous series of photographs which were made by another opposition figure sitting in a car, which was waiting for this guy who was running away with illegally printed documents. So he got in the car and they fled. They could get away a couple of streets until they were caught. But the interesting thing of this whole scenario is that everybody knew what everybody else was doing. So it wasn't a surprise to any of the participants. So by personal shadowing in this case, we mean it was also called an aggressive shadowing as a strategy, which meant that as soon as you were stepping out on the street, from 5 to 10 members of the secret police were surrounding you. By surrounding, I mean within 1 meter. They were standing and walking with you within about 1 meter distance, and they would be pushing you around and stuff like that. And that could happen for weeks on end. And so these guys were the editors of a very famous illegal samizdat publication, part of the second public sphere, and they had a very intricate system of smuggling documents and then printed texts and the sort of copies of journals. And so this was one event where when the secret police was trying to get the documents, despite the fact that they knew exactly where the storages were. So it was a game that really involved all the participants without any kind of very decided ending. Up to the fact that a couple of weeks after these harassments were going on, the members of the opposition filed an official complaint to the interior minister and the head of the Hungarian police for stopping these harassments, which actually stopped afterwards. So it's again sort of a fictional scenario which was playing out with real lives. But you can sort of see what is the kind of framework that we can understand the city and games playing in the city in a totalitarian context where the sort of borderlines are never exact. Meanwhile, if you were a kid at this time, so this is 1981, and you were watching the television in the evening, one of the most popular cartoons on Hungarian television was the checkered ear rabbit, who's it's a rabbit that lives on the top of a housing estate building. And what he does is he has a telescope, and then he looks around the public spaces. This is a housing estate, so the only sites that you see are outside. They are public spaces in a housing estate. There's no historical city. The only historic reference is the suitcase that the checkered rabbit lives in. And what he does is he looks for children who are playing, and then he's sort of keeping them in safety. So as soon as there's a kid who is one of these sort of little villains, he flies there with propelling his ears, and then he sort of reprimands them and corrects the mistakes. So there's a sort of eye of the beholder in the form of a lovely cartoon figure who's sort of keeping the order in public space. So this is the sort of setup for the changes, and you can see how this sort of fragmented city and individual strategies for living in the city led up to 1989, where the main question with the transitions to market economy and the open society that we started to live in are whose game are we really playing at this point? So is it really a new society? Is it a sort of stepping out of these shadows of individualism and building a new civil sphere? Well, not really. Obviously, the very harsh conditions of the market economy, the crisis of the early 1990s, really reinforced this sort of individual survival as not only a financial but also a kind of a moral value. And so public spaces were largely left still in the hands of whoever wanted to claim them. So the sort of civil responsibility to maintain public spaces, that public spaces were the actual sites of shared memory where we sort of identify ourselves, were still fairly invisible. And the first attempts were to sort of change this situation were by artists. There was a show in 1993 curated by the Hungarian Kunsthalle called Polyphony, which was considered a failure, but it nevertheless involved a number of art projects which were the first to happen in public space, which sort of provided an alternative, playful language that you could use in public space. So this artwork by Antal Lackner is two signs on one of the bridges in Budapest saying "over here" and "over there," which refer to the kind of identities and kind of a competition between the Pest and the Buda sides. For those of you who haven't been to Budapest, the Danube is sort of cutting the city into two halves. One is Pest, the other is Buda. And there has always been a kind of rivalry between the two sides, one being the more intellectual and bourgeois, the other one is the more middle class, lower class, but also much more lively and dynamic. So this is the sort of identifying the crossing of from over here to over there. Also, artists were commenting on this sort of subcultural or individual memories of or narratives in public space. There was one project which was to make permanent the graffiti that appeared before 1990, that striptease that referred to a punk band that operated before the change. And the artist János Sugár, he created this striptease out of like a metal installation that he put on the walls of this building, which is actually right across the municipal hall. And there was also a project where all the exhibition venues in Budapest closed for a day as a sort of an institutional critique. But it was nevertheless considered a sort of a failure. Okay, that is the last one, saying "my day is ruined if I cannot destroy 3 evildoers," which was appearing on public transport. So you can see that there's an attempt to use the surface of the city, public space, to tell stories, to sort of reveal identities in a very kind of reserved manner. And one of the key criticisms towards this show was disputing the relevance of artists in social critique and the sort of what the hell they're looking for in urban space. There were arguments on both sides whether they should or should not be involved in this. So if we look at these post-socialist spaces, you can say that they're largely defined by an inadequate public use. So there's a very weak civil control, which is reflected in the ownership, so the social practices of the lack thereof, and the kind of their disposal at the hands of politics or consumerism. Now the games, if we look back, what can they do in this situation is they can make use of individual or shared memories, or this sort of these kind of memories that can be extracted from urban space and make them performative in order to reveal something that is hidden, or to enable the sharing of such memories and the sort of creating platforms for conflicts and discussions. So one of the first projects to do this was a project called Own Eyes by an artist duo in 1997 who gave disposable cameras to homeless people and asked them to document their own lives. So you can see a couple of photographs of homeless. I think this was for a couple of weeks, and then there was a show where each of the homeless participants were always also commenting on what they photographed and why they photographed that and so on. This was the first project to kind of explicitly reveal a part of society which had been not only illegal before 1989, but also after 1990 it was completely invisible. It was considered immoral, invisible, and something that just society at large had nothing to do with. And all of a sudden here's a different reading of public spaces by those who actually inhabit them and have no choice to go anywhere else. Another attempt by the Ludwig Museum Budapest was a project on Moscow Square, which was a so-called public art show of a very questionable results, which aimed much more from sort of revealing narratives, as you saw with the previous, or the sort of first project that I showed you, to use public space as a platform for discussion. So Corey Young, the British artist, had a dispute settlement table there, which was up for a couple of weeks, and you could go there and have disputes settled by a professional. Some other artists created installations that were asking for the public to intervene. And the Moscow Square being one of the most important sort of social hubs as well as transportation hubs of the city, which involves workers, sort of impromptu workers market in the early hours of the day where people go to sell themselves for the day for day jobs. And then all the upper middle class coming down from the Buda Hills is also going through this space. So it's a very diverse social mix, but still most of these projects completely ignored the fact of who actually goes through there and what they might be entitled to do, and then how they can be involved in any action. So I'd like to show you in the remaining time, I don't know how much time I have left. Okay, so some prototypes for what's going on today, and to sort of draw this thing closer to games explicitly. The first game that had Budapest as itself and not as something else was a not very good game, which was called War on Terror, where one of the sites of the sort of counter-terrorist network was Budapest, and this is Elizabeth Square, which is one of the central squares in Budapest. So this is 2003. It's not a very good game, but nevertheless for gamers it was a sort of a revelation that all of a sudden it wasn't an abstract space that you were playing in, but more like a specific everyday venue of your life. And this thing became much more intricate in 2006 when the very same space became the site of street riots. And so you could see the very same vehicles, the very same type of fights breaking out in actual physical reality, which is the first time, basically since 1956, you could say, that such riots, such uncontrolled street fights broke out. Of course, I mean, 2006 was also the 50th anniversary of 1956, the revolution, and so this was also a scene from 2006 where one of the tanks from 56 exhibited was stolen and started by one of these fighters, and so they were sort of going up against the police with a tank, which was a pretty a tough situation for a couple of minutes. But you can see how the sort of jump from this to this is really a very easy and also a very sort of delicate situation of all of a sudden everyone who lived in Budapest had a very different image of their own city, of what public spaces are about and what they might contain. A more peaceful but sort of similar project, which in my view, is one of the most successful public art projects after 1989, is a sculpture piece that was part of an annual competition for public art and public installations. It's called a punching bag, and it's really what it is. It was a punching bag that was put out, suspended in Blaha Luisa Square, which is one of the central, again, a very busy downtown square. It's hanging from an installation, and you could just go there and kick it around, and it sort of led to all sorts of spontaneous social events and social gatherings and boxing competitions, and also some street fights, more like brawls around the night buses. When, of course, the police came and took it down. So you could see that such a kind of a risky situation where the state or the police doesn't have 100% control over what's happening in public space. They were extremely wary to go into any sort of discussions on okay, what's behind this? Whether that's a social conflict, whether that's a conflict with ethnicities, gypsy groups who were living in the area, or anything else. They just took it down as a sort of a criminal act. Now, another strategy for the sort of political involvement in the public sphere was a campaign event for one of the politicians in a municipal campaign who put out the poster saying, "We built a new park and come check it out." And so what he did was he took a newly renovated square and just laid the grass carpet on it. He set up a couple of tents, and you can see a billboard with an aerial photograph of the district, where you could sort of put out these stickers of your favorite places. So it was a sort of a simulated participation event to kind of, crowdsource issues that he would be taking on as a politician. Now, the sort of intricacy of this thing is that the newly renovated square was cut in half by a street that was built to support the construction at the end of that street, and this is still there. So, the elections were gone in 2006, and the square has remained in this status pretty much up to today. So you can see that the sort of the sort of appropriation of public space is something so momentary that it's very difficult to engage in scenarios which lead to longer term changes and longer term ownership, or especially sort of civil control. So if we look back at this sort of outset of how games use their own environment, focus on their actual environment instead of creating alternative realities and enable these realities to be shared. You can see now why they have, I think, an enormous potential that goes way beyond the intersection of art and performance and gaming in post-socialist cities. These are tools to explore public space as a social experience, and to explore the control of public space as a social experience. So this is one of the games that were developed by Invisible Playground, which involved people moving around in a subway area, in the sort of underpasses where there's prostitution, there's illegal trading, which pretty much everyone is crossing every day, but not looking anywhere. And these are situations where participants could or had to engage with people who practically live there. I mean, prostitutes and smugglers and so on, in order to perform tasks within the game, so that you can create these kind of encounters. Now, I think one of the key challenges is to avoid the sort of fictional realities, the sort of double realities that I had talked about earlier on. So if you develop games in these cities, I think it's a very important distinction or decision whether you would be going the way traditional logic goes, that is creating a fictional reality that coexists with the actual city, and the sort of fiction can take over reality entirely. So what the actual situation is in a square doesn't really matter. It's much more important what you name the square and how you look at it, and what sort of symbolic content you read out of it. Instead of this, I think it's much more important in games to create tools to get back to an everyday reality, to actually create working knowledge of the city, to create an empowering and also subversive situation where the participants of the game can actually find their ways back to live a successful to have a successful life within the actual urban environment. So this is, you know, an experiment from yesterday. I saw this as some sort of model for this, where you inject a sort of proto-capitalism in the heart of the socialist utopia. So using this square to develop a kind of capitalist project is, I think, very exciting. So to wrap up, I think this is my main thesis to take away, that games are exercises to experiment with freedom, to experiment with conflicts, to experiment with debates. They're a platform and also a safe environment where you can kind of fool the participants into doing stuff that they would not be doing otherwise, and which they should be doing otherwise, which would sort of relate to their own lives and to their own successful understanding of public space, especially given the fact that I think cities and understanding the urban environments that we live in will become much more important than they have been in the close future for businesses, for individual success, and for a meaningful cultural existence too. So yeah, this is pretty much what I wanted to say, and thank you.
So thank you for the talk. Are there any direct questions to Samu that you'd like to ask?
So what does it mean that we actually got thrown away by the police yesterday?
Yeah.
Farnwell.
Yeah. So you didn't mention that.
I think it was an integral part, really. I mean, if you look at it that way, that the police was called on by the people who live in the neighborhood and the people who lived in these buildings. I mean, I'm speculating, but the ones who received these apartments at first were the members of the Workers' Party, who were the sort of prominent owners who were donated these apartments. And if it was one of them, then you could say that's a sort of a revenge from a socialist or a memory or a sort of monument for its deconstruction.
Mm-hmm. How would you compare the post-socialist space here, like at Strausberger Platz, with Budapest?
I think, I mean, I could look at it on several levels. If I'm not going to talk about the sort of urban typology at this point, because it's also different. So Budapest, the general architecture environment of Budapest is of a different era. So this sort of period left a much smaller mark on the city, at least on the downtown, if you will. I think that in Germany or in Berlin especially, Berlin is in a very specific situation, being the kind of cultural capital of Europe, being the capital of a country that's been reunited. So I think to look at such patterns, you would have to go further east to Leipzig or Dresden or any of the cities that have been kind of left behind in this unification process. So in Berlin, I think this kind of memory and understanding of what social good is or what public space is in a very specific situation, because it's been a conscious policy by the state as well to deal with this issue. Whether that's, you know, a positive or a negative thing is an entirely different discussion, but it's out in the public, so it's something that's being talked about. Whereas in Budapest and in many other cities, this is something which is not really being discussed. So it's being discussed in terms of you know, what's illegal, what's legal, what you're supposed to be doing, who's in charge, but not in terms of okay, what does this thing really mean? So, for example, the current government started renaming public spaces again. After obviously realizing that society at large, and I'm again generalizing here, but the sort of social practices in urban space have not changed that much since the 80s, and which also means that it's a potential for gaining political momentum, for, you know, populist politics, for any sort of groups. It's really sort of irrespective of what side you're on, and so I think there's a unreflected continuous existence of these logics on almost all levels of society, but they are now being instrumentalized in politics and in business, and I think that's a major difference, and that's why I think that it's very important to be able to provide tools to criticize that and to kind of open that up, or to show alternatives and to kind of yeah, to create a realistic existence within the city. I think that's, I don't know if I can put it into any other terms, but that's actually real, and that's not a sort of real fiction.
Any more questions? Okay, great.
Thanks.
So thank you, all of you, for this first part of the day.